Between 1964 and 1975, the U.S. became involved in a conflict in the Southeast Asian country of Vietnam. Over 2.5 million Americans served in Vietnam, averaging 22 years in age. They were 4 years younger than the troops in World War II. Myth. Most Vietnam veterans were drafted. Truth. 2/3 of those who served in Vietnam were volunteers. Myth. The war was fought largely by the poor and uneducated. Truth. 79% had a high school education or better. It is rumored that the fighting in the South Pacific was more severe during World War II. This is untrue. During World War II, the average soldier saw 40 days of combat in 4 years. During Vietnam, the average soldier saw 240 days of combat in 1 year. The major contributor to the spike in combat days between the two wars was the helicopter. The helicopter provided unprecedented mobility for our troops. Approximately 12,000 helicopters saw action in Vietnam, and without it, it would have taken 3 times as many men to secure the 800-mile border between Cambodia and Laos. Medevac helicopters flew nearly 500,000 missions and airlifted approximately 900,000 patients, with nearly half of those being Americans. With all the action the helicopter saw, it's no wonder that the unmistakable sound of a Huey triggers memories for those who serve.
I can hear a helicopter well before anybody else can. And I have a hearing problem. But I guess it's embedded in my brain because a helicopter always meant help in one nature or another. Either was coming to get our killed or our wounded, resupply, more men for reinforcement.
I was talking with an Army nurse that had been at China Beach, and she said when she got finished in Vietnam and came home, she was destroyed. And she said, even to this day, anytime she hears that thump, thump, thump of a Huey, she breaks out in a cold sweat. Because she said those choppers never brought us good news.
I still have some dreams. I can remember pulling that body with where the brain fell out. I mean, every now and then I'll get some dreams about that or something. I have my moments.
I can understand how it will affect some.
Yeah, you know, it's still back there.
Vietnam veterans are men and women. They were farmers, students, mechanics, steel workers, nurses, and priests when the call came that changed them forever. They had dreams and plans which had to change or wait. Private First Class Leo Curtis Chase, Jr. is unable to be with us. He was the first resident of St. Johns County to be killed in the Vietnam War. Leo was an infantryman in the 7th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division, Air Mobile. In November 1965, he and 300 fellow soldiers lost their lives in the Ai Drang Valley, fighting for their country and their friends. This documentary is dedicated to him. Leo may be unable to tell his story, but others, your neighbors and friends, are willing to share theirs.
The chances were very, very good that I was going to be drafted. I decided, based on the experience of my dad, my uncles, and others, that I'd volunteer for 3 years to serve my country.
I was a very restless young man, and I couldn't wait to leave that town, and I just wanted to see the world.
When I was a sophomore in high school, I'd already developed my career plans at that time. I wanted very deeply to be an Indiana State State Trooper. They informed me that I would not have any trouble being an Indiana State policeman, but they preferred those candidates have the military behind them, and they said that the best Indiana State Troopers are former Marines. Well, that's all I needed to hear, and that's why I went to the Marine Corps.
They were drafting, they had the draft going on, and I didn't have a number at that point, but I thought, you know, geez, if I enlist, you can get a 2-year enlistment rather than a 4-year. So I thought, well, I'll go in for 2 years and then I'll decide if I want 2 more years. So that's what I ended up doing.
I just knew that as soon as I got through school, I talked to the recruiter and I went in the Navy. I paid a little bit of attention to what these guys were doing, these corpsmen were doing, and I thought to myself, looks like those guys got a pretty good job. So when I went back to finish up boot camp and went to classification, the classifier's talking about, well, what would you like to do? Where would you like to go, and what do you want to do? And I said, be any possibility of being a hospital corpsman? And I thought the guy was going to come out of his chair and kiss me. He says, oh yes, there's a great opportunity for you to be a hospital corpsman. He says, your scores were great, you'll do well.
I went through, I think it was a first or second gunnery training, so I learned all of the miniguns and rockets and all that. So when I went to Vietnam, first thing I said, I want to fly guns because that's what I came over here for. So anyway, I got into a gun company.
I reported into Vietnam to 5th Special Forces Group headquarters, and I was with about a dozen other guys, and the adjutant was there and briefed us a little bit on going to A camps and various Special Forces assignments, and at the end he said, are any of you interested in volunteering for extremely hazardous duty? And somebody asked a couple of questions about what it was, and they said, well, we really can't tell you until you volunteer. So myself and one of my friends volunteered for it, and we were assigned to SOG, MACV SOG, a Military Assistance Command Vietnam Studies and Observation Group. It sounded like a bunch of academians studying, researching old libraries and coming up with data for use by the bigwigs. And in effect, what it was studying and observing the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia. It was classified, highly classified, because at that time, Laos and Cambodia were neutral countries and we were not supposed to be there. And unfortunately, the North Vietnamese were there in huge numbers, and it was decided that it was necessary to conduct a number of activities and operations along the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
When we went to Vietnam, we were all split up. We didn't go as a unit. We all went as replacements to different units. So therefore, the camaraderie that you might have if you were all together going over as a unit, we didn't have that at all.
I remember the very first day that I was in battle. It's a very memorable moment for me. I was a 20-year-old Marine at the time, participating in a full-fledged Marine Corps amphibious assault on a beach just north of Da Nang, Vietnam. The coxswain of this small craft received a radio message, take them on in, hit the beach. All of these little craft line up abreast of each other and move forward toward the beach in unison. At about that moment, there's a sergeant that will give the order to lock and load. And at that moment, you stop puking and adrenaline takes over.
I was only in country about 3 days, 4 days, and they were going to go out on an ambush, a platoon-size ambush, and they'd made me a machine gunner. So I'd never really worked on the M60 machine gun, and they said, you're the machine gunner. And I remember we got up alongside of a barn. It was a kind of strange because it was like a long rectangular barn, and half of us were at one end of the barn, and the other half of us had made the turn and were heading up the length of the barn. And I was about halfway up the length of the barn when I guess a Vietcong, somebody fired about 2 rounds at us. Well, that we all opened up. I literally held that M60 machine gun like John Wayne, and I was emptying it. Somebody yelled they're in the barn, and I started firing into the barn, and we all fired. And with that, after a few minutes, we realized everybody that we were kind of shooting towards each other, so we stopped. And unfortunately, the next morning after it was all done, we found out we'd killed 11 water buffalo. We didn't have any Vietcong, but we had 11 dead water buffalo. We set in that night on a hillside afterwards, and I remember just from all that adrenaline and nerves, I remember I got an upset stomach about an hour afterwards, maybe an hour and a half afterwards, because you had so much acid in your system. But that was my initiation.
And the second night I was there, I knew why, because we got mortars in that night. And that was my introduction, that, hey, this is Vietnam, and there really is a war.
When mortars come in, they're quite devastating. And if you're in the near vicinity of a mortar, you're either going to suffer death or loss of some of your body. It's that simple. Many times I would have to help put some of my comrades on a helicopter that were either wounded or killed. I do recall this one Marine. He had received some shrapnel from a mortar fire directly into his abdomen, and his stomach was wide open. When a helicopter comes down to pick up something, I mean, it's quick. And I told him, I said, hold your hand right here, and what he was doing was holding his intestines in. And that's difficult. I don't want to say any more.
The following night, the VC tried to overrun the Seabees compound, and it was my first real experience there, listening to exchange of fire between 50 caliber machine guns and the mortars. And I thought, well, you know, it's a big city and it looks peaceful during the day, but it's somebody else's world at night.
I had a brother-in-law who was with the Armed Forces Radio Network. If anybody's ever seen Good Morning Vietnam.
Good morning, Vietnam. And welcome back to the Dawn Buster on this Saturday morning.
For about 10 days I was there and running around Saigon with my brother-in-law, and then after that I got back to Phu Bai, and they told me I'd been assigned to a combined action platoon. I didn't even know what a CAP unit was. And the combined action platoons were set up near the villages, and they had these areas where the idea was that you had a small number of American forces working with the villagers to try and more of a pacification program. At the same time, you were stationed where the bridges were, and you had a compound that you'd build out there to kind of give security along Highway 1, which was the main road going north and south within South Vietnam.
The mission that we went out to, an orphanage called at Bin Son, which was about 15 miles out in what they called Indian country at the time. And it was Catholic nuns and a priest, and they were just real fine ladies. And they had about 50 kids out there of all sorts of ages and sizes. And they provided school for them as required in Vietnam. But the weird part about it was there was 3 kids assigned to each desk. We took them a lot of stuff, the Hands Across the Sea, Red Cross packages that came. And it was funny, when you'd set up a trip to go out to the orphanage, it was sort of a well-guarded secret, because you knew you were going to get shot at going out, and you knew you were going to get shot at coming back. The trucks, the Marines sandbagged them and put M60s machine guns up on the top, and everybody wore flak jackets and weapons.
What's your name? What's your name, you? What's your name? Number 10. Hát ca lương đi.
The kids came over around the Marines because the Marines had candy and had goodies, and the kids were looking for that. And unfortunately, in the midst of this, one of the youngsters was up close with one of the Marines and managed to pull the pin out of a hand grenade that was on his belt. And of course, the hand grenade went off and killed the Marine, killed the kid, several others in the area, injured and wounded a lot of other people, at which point everybody that was able grabbed somebody that you could and hauled butt for the helicopters. And they were already cranking up. Somewhere between where we were and the bird, there was a Vietnamese came running out of the woods, and he had a rifle. And of course, nobody knew who he was or what he was, so the crew chief swung the M60 around and made short work out of him.
And SOG had a variety of missions. Primarily was intelligence gathering. You had small teams, maybe 6 or 7 indigenous mercenaries and a couple of Green Beret Special Forces NCOs, or low-ranking officers who were on the team, maybe 8 or 9 man team altogether. And they did not wear military uniforms. They did not wear dog tags. They didn't wear anything, any kind of identification that would associate them with the United States government. And just like on some of the spy movies you see, we were told that they would disavow knowledge of us if we were captured or whatever. And again, you went into these operations wearing what they called sterile uniforms. Operations in Cambodia, you didn't even carry U.S. weapons. You had to carry Swedish Ks or AK-47s or so on. Some of our teams actually dressed in North Vietnamese uniforms when they crossed the border. They gathered intelligence along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. They would be dropped 20 miles into Laos, and they would move maybe 4 or 5 clicks to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, set up 10 feet off of the road, hide in the bushes, and then count the number of trucks that went by, or tanks, or personnel, and then back off and call airstrikes on them. Another mission that we had was POW Snatch, to try and grab a prisoner of war. The team leaders carried 22s with silencers for that purpose, and that was always a secondary mission on every SOG mission that was run.
If you find as pilot command, you flew in the right seat, and you shot. Normally, you shot rockets. The miniguns were attached to the left seat, but you could fire them in a stowed position. But the left seat could just like a hose, just put it wherever. And then you had both door gunners in the back, so they were just awesome when you're breaking away from a target, because they can see behind and keep firing on the target, so you can get you can get out of dodge. And it is amazing how many bullet holes you can put in a helicopter and not knock it down. The door gunners are worth their weight in gold.
The NVA forces was the organized military force that we were really the Marines and the Army were going to war with all the time. The Vietcong were the guerrilla forces on the side.
The Vietcong, they had no uniforms. They were just pajamas, and that's about all.
Anywhere they could disrupt our progress with the people was what they wanted to do. And if it involved a disruption of humanitarian efforts, that was it. Intimidate the people to not befriend and not trust the Americans.
The Viet Cong were there, and should they know that a certain village received help from us, intelligence, then they in turn would have harm caused to them by the Viet Cong, either to those people that may have talked or to their family, and I'm talking deaths. So, if somebody were to ask you a question and you know that if you answered it, you may be killed, would you answer the question?
Searching for the enemy. Move out.
In a book by John Plaster, who I served with, called The Secret Commandos, he talks about SOG in 1968 had 100% casualty rate, and that's why they called it extremely hazardous duty. and everybody in the particular unit I was supposed to go to was either killed, wounded, or missing in action. And there were some guys who weren't hit, but there were some other guys who were hit multiple times, and they had some very high casualty rates throughout the war. And in that book, it's related about 18 teams were either completely overrun or lost and never heard from again. You were working with either Vietnamese or Chinese or Cambodian mercenaries, and every now and then you got a bad guy who was on your team, and every now and then you'd have a team that was never heard from again.
We always had 2 South Vietnamese regular soldiers with each of our squads who were used primarily for interpretation. And I never trusted them. They would always be speaking in Vietnamese, and they knew English very well, almost all of them. And I always assigned a couple men in my squad to watch them all the time, particularly at night. I would never allow them out of my sight, my squad's sight, because I didn't know whether they were really on our side or helping out the Vietcong.
I ended up on bridge security, so I was outside the compound when we got hit. We had claymore mines all around the compound. All the wires to the claymore mines had already been cut, so you had an inside job. So I'm shooting down the road because they were crossing the road towards the compound in front of me, and I'm firing in that direction, and there's nobody over there by me, but as clear as I'm talking to you, a voice came into my head and said, "Move now." So I moved around to the corner of the bunker, and just as I put my rifle to my shoulder and got ready to start firing again, the whole thing blew up. Knocked me down by the river into a bunch of concertina wire, busted my left eardrum, and you know, more of the concussion effects and some other stuff, but nothing serious. I crawled back up. I mean, I remember could hear the other guys yelling from the other side, yelling my name to see if I was still alive, and you know, finally as my head cleared enough I could respond. And I looked around the front, and that post where I'd been leaning against had about maybe that much of it sticking out. A B-40 rocket had hit. Now you hear them talking in Iraq and Afghanistan about the RPGs, rocket-propelled grenades, and that B-40, that's what those were. But that was probably the one time where I really didn't know that I was going to make it through that night.
I am indeed fortunate. Out of the 14 original men in my squad that I started with, 2 of us came back.
I came back from Vietnam. I was home for 30 days leave. I went to Portsmouth Naval Hospital to another school and went on with my career and didn't miss a beat.
Well, I tell you what, I had a great time. I saw a lot of things. I had a great bunch of people. Have a wife and 2 fine kids. Yeah, I wouldn't trade it for anything. I really would.
It was a great adventure. Came back. You know, you're always young and married. The welcome back home was not, by then things had changed quite a bit. It wasn't the welcoming, hey, you know, from people around you, you know, and you just had to kind of assimilate back into society and keep your head low and, you know, not you know, broadcast that you were, you know, a Vietnam veteran that much. Wasn't a real popular thing.
We have some boys and girls now that go to Afghanistan and Iraq and Kuwait, and God bless them all, each and every one of them, and I mean that. When they return, people throw confetti at them. When I returned from Vietnam, people threw things at me. And it's a shame. I personally do not believe we belonged in Vietnam, but I was a good Marine. I did what I was told, and I like to think I did it well. Going through 4 years of the Marine Corps and all that I did, I like to think that I matured a little bit. Well, I can tell you I did, quite a bit. And I decided at that point that I was going to go to college.
It was extremely difficult for me when I got back. You know, I had just turned 21 when I was discharged, and the previous year I ran top secret missions, some very, very difficult ones with Special Forces NCOs and indigenous mercenaries. I ran some of the hardest missions they had and did it successfully and brought my people home. And when I got discharged and just sitting around Trenton, it was like, what am I going to do now? There's nothing in the world that is going to be as hard as what I just did. Am I going to be an insurance salesman or a stockbroker or working a steel mill? I was kind of baffled at that point. And that's when education, you recognize that it's a valuable thing. That's what I decided to do, was take advantage of my GI Bill and go back to college and develop some time to think about it and some maturity to know what I wanted to do. The bottom line is, to me, I had two paths to choose. One was a very mundane path of going to college and getting a deferment and doing that thing. The other path was to go to Vietnam and meet and serve with heroes and legends. And that was the path I chose, and I'm extremely proud that I did.
Leo and his family epitomized the service, sacrifice, and the courage of the true heroes of the Vietnam War. In Washington, D.C., the name Leo C. Chase, Jr. is engraved in the wall, the granite monument dedicated to those who paid the ultimate price in the Vietnam War. But his name, and the names of more than 58,000 others, is deeply engraved in living memorials. They are engraved in the hearts and minds of everyone who served with them, those who carry the burden of their loss. But they carry that burden willingly because they're brothers.